and a 3, and a 2, and a 1. Hello, folks, one and all. I'm going to let the stream kick in for a second, and I'm going to explain what I am doing right now. And I might sound weird this whole entire stream, and I'll kind of explain it. I am exhausted right now. I have been trying to sleep for 4.5 hours. I've just been laying in bed. I've tried various things to try and get myself to go to sleep, and nothing's worked. And it's been a long time since I've had a night like this, and I'm just sort of resigning to myself to tiredness tomorrow. And I got to the point of I was just laying there doing nothing for so long that I wanted to do something. Hello there, Muha. And I decided, you know what? I am so tired, and I'm thinking about horror game design as I'm laying here in bed. Might as well just get up and share some 3 a.m. thoughts about horror game design. I don't actually know how many people are going to watch this, probably only like 1 or 2 people. I'll make it an actual video once it's up and it'll go live. Just know these are ramblings of a person who is exhausted right now and is sleepy, just can't actually fall asleep, and has been trying for hours and hours, and now is deciding to talk about horror game design. So, firstly, what are we going to be talking about? I don't actually know. This has absolutely no plan. I've got some stuff I opened up just in case. Also, I got this playlist of music, which I thought I'd play, so I'm just going to start playing that now. However, I've always wanted to talk more about horror game design in general. This is probably not the best opportunity to get off on a foot on the map, but hey, I'm tired enough to talk about this. Horror game design is a topic that absolutely interests me. I think about it all the goddamn time. It's almost pathetic to the level of which I have sought out ways to find people talking about horror game design. I have gone out of my way to find horror game analyses, horror game reviews, horror game podcast discussions. I watch and listen and all that to a lot of this in my free time of working on things. It's a lot of what I listen to as I work. There's only a finite amount of resources out there for that, unfortunately, this topic and what I can get of it, so I love hearing other people's thoughts on horror game design. I will mention the chats on the screen because I will be responding to them, and I know it won't really be kept fully in the video or whatever, so that's why it's there. You guys are unfortunately going to have to sort of stare at this boring screen. I could have prepared something cooler, but again, this is a very impromptu discussion topic, and I'm too lazy right now and tired and all that to really set it up into a fancier way. However, I've thought a lot about game design, and there's a lot of aspects to horror game design in particular which I find to be absolutely fascinating, and I'm going to go talk about some right now. We're going to just kind of move from conversation topic to conversation topic. I warned, I am tired. I am actually reading the chat. So there's a very high chance this will get very off topic and go into whatever discussions. This is essentially just a social feed stream. Now, with all that explanation stuff out of the way and my tired night ramblings, let's get started. Now, I should clarify, even though you guys cannot see it, I have opened up one of my favorite lists on the internet, which is a list of nearly every PS1 and PS2 horror game ever released. Now, I should clarify something. It's not everyone, but I'd say it's like 95% of them. There's a few, like, there's this one game that's called Raizuo or something for the PS1, which is not on this list, and is a really niche, obscure PS1 horror game, which is in my collection, which is this first-person Japanese-only horror game where you walk around, there's a lot of creepy dolls around. It is not... You don't physically, like, walk around. It's like plays in the old Phantasy Star style. I've thought about doing a video of that before, but it's a game that's kind of narrative focused, and the puzzles have a lot of words, and since I can't read Japanese, you know, how much am I really going to get out of it? Hopefully one day that gets English translated, though the odds of that are very, very slim, because I don't even think many people even know that game exists. And if something like Twilight Syndrome can't get translated, then how the fuck would Raizuo or whatever get translated? Anyways, that's me getting off topic. I'm probably going to do that a lot here today. So on this PS1 listing you guys can't see, they're kind of set by semi-genres, and the first things that pop up are a bunch of Japanese sound novels. If you don't know what Japanese sound novels are, they're essentially visual novels, but with voice acting and sounds and atmospheric tension and all that. Most of these, unfortunately, never came outside of Japan, so you never really get to experience them unless you live in Japanese, what I was about to say, unless, of course, you can read Japanese. However, they do open up more properly with the Clock Tower games, and you know what? The Clock Tower franchise is a fantastic place to start talking about horror game design. Not only because of its age, but that series is utterly fascinating. Now, I should clarify something. The thing which I put into my mind when I laid in bed and thought to myself, hey, Ron, it'd be a good idea to get up because you can't sleep for 4.5 hours and just start talking and rambling on the internet, was that I would focus on my favorite segments of all the games we're going to be talking about. But I'm probably going to talk about more things than just my favorite segments because it includes a lot of interesting things to talk about. So, alright, let's talk about Clock Tower. I've played Clock Tower 1, both the original Super Nintendo version and the PS1 remake, which wasn't really a remake, more of like a remaster, as we know them in this day and age. I've also played Clock Tower 2, which is known as Clock Tower 1 in the America, because Clock Tower 1 never came to America, so they called Clock Tower 2 just Clock Tower. It's the CG one that's a direct sequel to the first NES Clock Tower. It's a very strange position, that whole entire situation. Back in the day, they used to think about how these different regions worked best to sort of appeal to Western audiences when they came to America. One of the more famous examples of this was that Final Fantasy IV was called Final Fantasy III in America, because Final Fantasy III never came to America, but they changed the numbering later when there was more synchronicity between both East and West gaming sides. Clock Tower suffered from this because the first Clock Tower game was Japanese only, and then Clock Tower 2 came to the West, but Clock Tower 2, you know, was the first game never released in America, but the second game did, so they just called it Clock Tower. And the weird thing about that is that Clock Tower 2 has a lot of story connections to Clock Tower 1, so they put in this intro. In fact, I think that part of the reason why they tell you the whole entire plot in Clock Tower 1's opening, or Clock Tower 2's opening, is because Clock Tower 1 never released here. So I think that developers knew this game was coming to the West and thought, well, you know, this is a direct sequel to the narrative of the first Clock Tower game. How can we make American audiences understand what's going on if they never played the first game? And I guess their answer was make a big, long, back then, long, 3-minute CG cutscene opening that basically just spoils the entire plot of the first game. All the same, let's talk about Clock Tower. I've played all the Clock Tower games but Ghost Head. I've played the first game, again, both versions. The second game, I've played the third game. I've played Haunting Ground. I've played Night Cry. I still need to finish Remothered. I played the beta of Remothered, which is not an official Clock Tower game, but a sort of Clock Tower Haunting Ground-esque game. Oh, excuse me a second. A comment popped up and I clicked it on accident. Fun. Alright, so put some stuff around here. Okay, so, to talk about Clock Tower 1, to be honest, there's something which I thought was always fascinating about the Clock Tower series. They are one of the earliest examples of horror games, like games that actually tried more thoroughly to be horror, and they definitely are ahead of their time, especially the first game. But the whole series is far more comedic than I think a lot of places write them off as. Like, the whole Clock Tower series is not really scary, okay, back when they released the first Clock Tower game, there was nothing that even attempted to do horror like that, so I can understand that back in the day people probably thought that was scary. I don't know how I would have felt if it was one of the earlier games I played. There's a man coming at you with giant scissors. That's gotta be terrifying, right? But frankly, there's a whole lot of silliness in this whole franchise, to the point that when people complain about Clock Tower 3 being silly, because Clock Tower 3 does, honestly, raise the silly bar by quite a bit, but it's very entertaining for its silliness. But the first Clock Tower game, even at the start of this whole franchise, was incredibly silly. There's a lot of really out there, funny things. A good example is Scissor Man coming down from the ceiling and banging onto a piano and then doing a crescendo down the piano as he does this little dance on it, and then jumps off and tries to chase you. And that's just a small example in a number of very bizarre, kind of absurdist humor moments inside of Clock Tower, the first game, and the whole entire franchise. Clock Tower's first game features something which I think is a little bit of a shame they didn't explain inside, or didn't really explore in later games. Hell, didn't much again. In the first Clock Tower game, they have this sort of open-ended narrative position where essentially what you do while you're exploring the Clock Tower 1 mansion has huge effects on what happens in your game style. It affects what characters live, it affects the solutions to puzzles, it affects what ending you're getting. There's a lot of small things that you do which basically sort of make it so You go through an interesting pathway in the game and makes your different playthroughs different based on like what things you explore first, what you respond to. The thing that doesn't make sense in the first Clock Tower game, though, is just what triggers what pathways you're on makes no sense. And I talked about this when I played it, the first Clock Tower game with Lindsay or Yumi. I still need to upload my PS1 playthrough where I got a few more endings and experimented more. But in the first Clock Tower game, there's just big leaps of logic that just don't make a lick of sense. There's this one character, there's a scene in Clock Tower, you can witness a few different quote-unquote deaths first. You'll either walk into the shower room and find your friend dead inside the shower. She'll be like, have her bed open, and then Scissorman will hop out of the water below her. Or your friend will be drowning in the pool by Scissor Walker stabbing her while they're in there. But there's a weird thing in Clock Tower, the first game, where it's kind of like a baby logic. And what I mean by baby logic is, for babies, when you do peekaboo, the reason why they laugh is because babies don't have the development necessary to realize that when you're gone, that you're not just like gone. It's something that takes a little bit for the brain to develop and understand that when you come back, you didn't go anywhere. It's not like you just stopped existing. You still exist, and it's just something that's in early child development, and it's interesting. But Clock Tower seems to apply to a world where the logic of babies applies to the real world, because how Clock Tower 1 works is if you don't see the deaths happen, they didn't happen. So there's a scene where you hear a girl scream outside, and if you go look at the window to see what's happening, then she's dead. But if you don't look out the window and don't see what's happening to her and why she screamed, she's okay, because you didn't see her die. So if you didn't see her die, she's fine. And that doesn't really make much sense, but it's how the game logic works. And that's the main issue with Clock Tower's thing, is that a lot of the logic just doesn't really make sense. Like, you would think, I don't know, why is not witnessing this murder mean that the murder didn't happen? Why do I have to perceive it to then make it so that she died? It's like, oh, if I hear somebody screaming and I go to investigate, then why is she fine if I don't investigate, but she dies if I go to witness her murder? There's a lot of weird logic like that in the whole entire series, but the first Clock Tower game kind of suffers from it the most. At the same time, though, there wasn't really a game with a structure like Clock Tower, so there's some forgiveness to some of the oddities in its game design, but it's still fascinating, though. And Clock Tower, I think, manages to get away with a lot of it due to being one of the quote-unquote forefathers of the genre. But honestly, if I think about Clock Tower, the whole entire experience is kind of like a single note. And what I mean by this is that I don't think it's a game of many highs and lows, the more I think about it, like I'm thinking about it right now. There's not really a moment of Clock Tower I can think of that's particularly bad, but there's not really a moment I can think of that's particularly good. And this is kind of a weird thing to talk about. A lot of games have moments of sort of highs and lows, peaks and valleys in game design. And you could say that Clock Tower, the Scissor Man, it could provide highs and lows. But to be honest, since he's kind of a semi-randomized, not fully randomized threat, and how his chase sequences work in the first Clock Tower game, they just kind of keep the game at the same pacing it's always at, because even when for those who don't know anything about Clock Tower, when you are getting chased, you enter into a state known as chase mode, which essentially when you're in chase mode, your interaction with objects is different. In other words, you can explore a room while you're just casually exploring, and it'll be different based on when you're casually exploring it and when you explore it later in chase mode, because your actions change. So this is true for the whole entire franchise. Essentially, there's two different states that you're either in one or the other. You're either in exploration mode or you're in chase mode. In chase mode, you can do things to try and stop the your actions and what you can interact with rooms change, essentially. The Ghost one has some bizarre logic as well, if I recall. You were talking about Clock Tower 3, the one which had the ghost that you could purify. Anyways, I'm gonna talk about this. I'm just gonna finish up my Clock Tower 1 talk for a second. But the thing is, despite all of this, Clock Tower, the first game, kind of had the same level of entertainment for me for the whole entire time. Clock Tower is enjoyable, and I kind of want to talk about locations in these horror games that I kind of adore, but there's not a moment in Clock Tower that I particularly adore. I mean, there's some rooms that are more interesting than other rooms, but there's nothing in Clock Tower I'm like, that is an amazing piece of horror game design. But then again, should I really expect that? The first Clock Tower game is very clearly like just an early example of horror game design. It's one of the first attempts of it. It's not the first, but it's the first that really sort of hit what it was trying to do out of the park. Literally Alone in the Dark comes before that, but we're going to talk about that another time. I think Clock Tower, the second one, which was just known as Clock Tower in America, was the 3D one on the PlayStation 1 that was not Ghost Head. I'm also going to take a sip of water. Okay, so to talk about the first Clock Tower, not well, the first Clock Tower, but the second one, I mean. Again, I'm tired, so forgive me if some of this rambling is nonsensical. For the second Clock Tower game, there was a sort of fascinating aversion to the game design that the first game did, but even going more cryptic and confusing. I would actually argue that the second game has more bullshit in it than the first game did. Oh, excuse me, that's a complete accident on my side. To talk about this for a second. The first Clock Tower game, I keep on saying first, but I mean the second. Again, sorry, tiredness here. The second Clock Tower game has it so that at the very beginning of the game, you select a character that you're playing as, because there's two playable protagonists. There's Jennifer, who is the protagonist of the first Clock Tower game, and then there's this other blonde woman I forget the name of. However, how you select your character literally makes no sense. And I forget the exact steps here, but there's this prologue chapter where you play as this other nameless dude, and there's a part where you can talk to two characters, and there's no signification of this, but whoever you talk to first or something like that is or chooses who you're going to play as. And let me clarify that two characters you're talking to are not the two characters you're going to play as. I think one is like a news reporter, and another person is... I fucking forget, it's been a while. However, though, just based on this arbitrary choice that you don't even realize is a choice probably the first time you play it, to chooses who you're playing as from that. And the game is full of really weird, bizarre leaps in logic there. I think that's one of the issues of the first two Clock Tower games. I will say they're very entertaining games, and I think they're worth playing if you go in the right mindset, but they're full of really bizarre design decisions that when people talk about Clock Tower, I don't really think they touch on this enough. Is that the design of these games, now given they're old games, I realize that this is working somewhat off of old adventure game logic, which old adventure game logic had some leaps in logic, but the thing is, some of this is just nonsensical of what makes really huge impacts in your like gameplay choices here. There's other weird things in the first Clock Tower game which don't seem like they should affect anything, but make the biggest worlds in the difference in what fucking ending you're going towards, and yeah, that's okay there. I couldn't sleep either, so here I am rambling about horror games that in my time zone is 3 AM in the morning, so I guess I'm starting with Clock Tower. Clock Tower 2, however, does very definably for me have a moment I think is better than the rest. It's not my favorite location visually, but honestly, the first main area of the game, which I believe is it's not a school, it's like a newspaper building or something. I'm not playing anything, I'm rambling about horror games as a heads up there. Just talking a lot about horror game design because I couldn't sleep. I was laying in bed for 4.5 hours. I'm exhausted right now, and I just felt like rambling about horror games right now, I guess. But anyways, talking about Clock Tower 2 again. In Clock Tower 2, there's this whole lawn stretch where you start the game inside this newspaper building. Now, visually, it's not the most interesting location, but I actually think in retrospect, if it was the best designed location in the game, that area has a sort of consistent Scissorman chase thing, so you can show up anywhere, but also has plenty of hiding spots, and what you need to do is not too cryptic, plus the area is big enough to be interesting, and the rooms have enough personality to them to be fascinating to look through. There's several other locations in Clock Tower 2, but I don't think they held up as well, because, for example, there's a house location, but the house location is a lot smaller than the other locations, but to make it so that you don't, like, blaze through it, to make what you have to do in there be extremely cryptic and kind of full of some bullshit stuff. I remember the part that got stuck at the most was this part involving, I think it was a dog. It was either a dog collar or a dog biscuit. It was some dog item. And I remember that the solution involved this, like, pixel-perfect thing they need to interact with. And anyways, it's just... I literally have very, very loose memories of the second Clock Tower game. Clock Tower 2 is very similar to Clock Tower 1 in the sense that I think that it has more highs and lows than the first Clock Tower game did, but I don't think it had anything that like struck me as something I really want to go in depth and talk about right now. Like, there's nothing in the second Clock Tower game which strikes me as saying, "No, that is fantastic horror game design." But there's still a lot of staples, and again, the second Clock Tower game, released after survival horror was established as a genre by the first Resident Evil, so it's a bit interesting to see that Clock Tower 2 doesn't really apply any of what was learned from Resident Evil, and it makes sense because it was in development before that period of time. It finished development after the first Resident Evil came out, but it started development before it came out, so it's just kind of doing its own thing that learned from Clock Tower. You could say the Clock Tower 2 in a lot of ways is a very I don't think it's as charming as the first Clock Tower, and I think the reason why when I'm thinking about this. The first Clock Tower 1's setting is more interesting. Like, the actual setup of the game and the setting is far more interesting. So, in fact, I think I know why, too. In Clock Tower 1, there is very little story, but the story that's there is interesting enough to sort of get the pace of the game going. In Clock Tower 1, you are Jennifer, an orphan girl who's adopted with some other orphan girls by this rich lady, who takes you to this giant, magnificent manor. And shortly after you arrive there, she disappears, and suddenly the Scissor Man comes and tries to kill you. It's a very simple premise, but the thing is that the setting is really interesting, and from then on out, you have enough of a setup. You are trying to escape and save any of the other orphan girls you can, while getting chased around by a man with scissors. That's a pretty simple, easy to get setup, and the location is interesting enough to keep the rest of the game going. And on top of this, the game is brief enough. You can complete the game easily in like an hour and a half to 2 hours your first time, and get there's multiple endings in the game, and a lot of them are pretty radically different actually, but you get one pretty quickly all the same. So Clock Tower 2 though suffers from an issue where there's too much story. Clock Tower 2 has it where after every single main level, you go through like 5 to 10 minutes of cutscenes, just a lot of people talking about miscellaneous things. There's usually multiple cutscenes in a row after each other before you get to go to the next story location. It's just these huge expedition dumps, and I think that sort of breaks up the pacing a lot. And because the game is so much more story focused, it also sort of leaks into the levels, so the ever-present story is still present. Now I can somewhat appreciate what they're going for. The second Clock Tower game has much more of a Giallo feel to it. The first Clock Tower game was trying to pull a lot from Phenomena, or Fenomeno, I believe that's what it's called, the Dario Argento film, which also stars a woman named Jennifer who looks just like Jennifer from the Clock Tower games. If you ever watched Fenomeno, if you've played Clock Tower 1, you can definitely spot where fucking Clock Tower ripped off multiple ideas from that film, which is fine, it's fine. Nothing bad about some inspiration, and I think they utilized it well, but anyways, there's always been sort of a Giallo flavor to the Clock Tower series. And to be honest, the Clock Tower games are like some of the Clock Tower and Clock Tower-esque games. Are some of the only games I can think of that have like stronger Giallo influence. I'm not going to say that no other horror game has any Giallo influence, but it's a genre which you don't see much of in gaming. And if you know what Giallo is, it's essentially Italian horror. But Italian horror has this very specific flavor to it if you start watching it. Giallo is sort of the precursor to the slasher film genre. And I adore Giallo horror films. Probably, a lot of people don't consider Suspiria to be a Giallo horror film because it sort of breaks a lot of trends of the genre, but I consider it to be one. And that's probably the one that most people are familiar with because there's the recent Suspiria remake. But Giallo has a lot of things they go for, including sort of the architecture. They have these certain song themes that play at these moments. Most of them are murder mysteries, where there's a murder that you need to solve with a thing that's famously known as the black-gloved killer. If you're curious why the genre is called Giallo, it's because Giallo is Italian for yellow. And back in the early 1900s in Italy, genres were color-coded, so that every single genre had a different color on a book cover to signify what genre it was. And horror/thriller was put under the yellow covers. So that is why Italian horror became known as Giallo, because it's Italian for yellow, aka the color that was signified with horror in genre labeling back in the early 1900s when books were color-coded there. Alright. But the Clock Tower series is the only franchise I can really think of which has really one of the only horror game stuff in general that has stronger Giallo influence. The first Clock Tower game 100% has Giallo influence because it is 100% ripping off of this one movie named Phenomena. There is some differences between them, but you can see some scenes in the movie that Clock Tower, the first game, very clearly ripped off of. And I mean, even the most obvious things that literally the main character of the movie Phenomena is this girl named Jennifer, and the main character of Clock Tower 1 is Jennifer, and she literally looks just like Jennifer from Phenomena. Like, she looks like a one-to-one copy of that character and has literally the exact same name. And anyways, that's a little bit too on the nose there, but all the same. However, despite the fact that the first Clock Tower game is directly ripping off of a Giallo horror, the second game feels more like a Giallo horror film. Partially because Giallo horror films usually sort of have this slow build-up and lots of long talking scenes. I personally enjoy them most of the time, but I think that it sort of breaks up the pace of the second Clock Tower game. But I can kind of see what they were going for. They were trying to make it a bit more like their source of inspiration. Aka was trying to be more like a Giallo horror film, and the pacing's kind of there, and they got some things right on that chord, but I think they also missed the mark on several marks, and I think that the story wasn't as twisty or interesting enough to really sustain itself. Which then brings us to Clock Tower 3, which I actually have more to say on than the first two Clock Tower games. The first two Clock Tower games I think are interesting in a time capsule, and if I wanted to go into an in-depth exploration of the game design of both of those games, I'd have to refresh myself on those games, because it's been a longer time since I played those, since I played Clock Tower 3 or Haunting Ground. But there is a lot to be said, especially as sort of early examples of horror game design and how they sort of built themselves without having as much reference to build themselves off of, since a lot of what Clock Tower 1 and Clock Tower 2 did, to their credit, was made through their own, like, invention. So they didn't really have other examples to look at to see what could work and what couldn't work. They were sort of just building something that wasn't, I won't say wholly unique, because obviously they had their own sources of inspiration and all that, but there weren't really other games like it in terms of the single stalker sort of gameplay that they utilized there. And they're kind of interesting because there's not very many horror games that play like Clock Tower 1 and 2, except for games that are directly later inspired by Clock Tower 1 and 2. Okay, take another sip of water. I'm going to have to refill my water because I'm sort of drinking this up really quickly. Okay, Clock Tower 3 I have a lot more to say about. So I think Clock Tower 3 is one of the funniest horror games I've ever played. If you have not seen or played Clock Tower 3, I very heavily suggest you either find a copy for yourself and play it. Clock Tower 3 does not go for nearly as expensive as so many other PS2 horror games. You can find a sort of reasonably priced copy last time I checked. Or watch someone else play it. I don't mean to shamelessly plug myself, because of course that means I'm about to. I do have a Let's Play of it on my channel myself, but there's a lot of other people who have played it, and if you have not played or seen Clock Tower 3 before, it is a fucking treat, and I'm going to tell you why before I start talking about the game design of this game. Clock Tower 3 is legitimately hilarious, and to kind of touch on why that is, part of it is that the game was made for Japan, and I'll talk more why I'm saying that in a second. It's set in an English, like a British English setting, but it very clearly was made for Japan, and there's some sort of language barrier hilarity from that. But Clock Tower 3 actually holds the honor to be one of the first video games to ever feature motion capture. And here's what I was sort of talking about with the Japanese focus. There are some videos that they released of development because they're using this cutting-edge new technology to do motion capture, which is very new for games at the time. Clock Tower 3 is like a 2003 game. And if you watch the motion capture videos, who they got to do the capture for the cutscenes were sort of Japanese play actors. Gotta leave? Of course, thank you, Joy. So, to talk about this, they got play actors to play this. And part of Japanese play acting, they actually even got like a film director from the region to film direct this. We're a remake of the Clock Tower series. Not really. I'll talk about that in a second. I'm actually A-okay with the spiritual reimaginings that they've been doing. Also, I don't think that could really happen due to the sort of legal limbo that the Clock Tower franchise is in. But anyways, talking more about this, I'll touch base on that when we get to the tail end of the Clock Tower discussion. Clock Tower 3 featured, I forget the name of this guy, but it's a famous Japanese director who directed the cutscenes, and I guess he's a really big fan of this certain type of, I forget what it's called, but there's a type of thing in Japan which isn't theater play, but it's this sort of acting where you move your body around a lot to express a story. And usually it's sort of like a comedy act where you are very emotive with your body and over-exaggerate your emotions to create a story. And I guess this director of this film was a really big fan of that genre. So the motion capture actors they got for Clock Tower 3 are these Japanese... I really wish I remember this term right now. But they're these actors that do these extravagant comedy movements. And I guess for their first chance of having motion capture, I can kind of see the logic in his head. We're going to make one of the... Rakugo, that's it. That is exactly it, Rakugo. Yes, the Japanese directed Rakugo, the... Oh God, I was just explaining it. The position to do sort of comedy acts using extravagant body motions. This director was a big fan of that, and I kind of understand what they're going for. We're making one of the first motion capture games ever, so our animation is going to be top of the line. But why settle for, you know, boring animations like normal people? What if we use this new technology in a very extravagant way? So from that kind of setup, I can understand what they were going for. But the results in the actual game are hilarious because the motions of all the characters are so extravagant to the point that it's silly. And it's not helped that there's a dissonance between these Japanese Rakugo actors and the English voice acting, because there's all these extravagant motions being done by these characters, and I don't think that the English voice actors got the memo, so they're speaking in these British English accents, and they're talking way too calm for their movements. And so, like, there's these hilarious scenes. So there's this scene where this character is, like, comedically rolling all over the bed and flailing around like a fucking maniac. And he's just talking this calm demeanor as he's doing this. Like, oh, calm down, Melissa. And while he's fucking waving his arms over the place and rolls off the bed. And it's like, there's a very strange but hilarious dissonance between the voice actors' voice acting. Because I'm pretty sure they weren't seeing the scenes they were voice acting. They were just kind of, like, detached from with the system and these extravagant motions, which kind of make it pretty funny. Not that the voice acting's bad, it's just there's the weird dissonance between the voice acting and the performance that's happening on screen, and that kind of makes the game pretty funny. Not to mention some of the cutscenes are bizarre. There's a number of them which are just very strange in their content. Not even touching on the fact that the game's entire plot is strange. Before I talk about the actual game design, I'm sorry, there's so many fascinating things about Clock Tower 3. It's hilarious. If you have never heard of Clock Tower 3, just kind of stick with me for a second. In Clock Tower 3, your mother tells you, "Sweetie, do not come home before the day after your 17th birthday. Do not come to this place on your 17th birthday. Do not come. Do not come. You can come after your 17th birthday, but don't come here on your 17th birthday." So, of course, that means Alessa comes here on her 17th birthday. Be like, "Hey, Mom, why'd you send me a letter telling me not to come here on your 17th birthday? I thought I would come here on my 17th birthday because you told me not to." Anyways, so she enters here, and there's this extravagant man who wears this, like, black cloak and these kind of black fuzzy clothes, and he's sort of in a beast man. He has a cane and a top hat, and he does this extravagant dance around the room because they do extravagant animations to the game, as he talks out creepily, and before you know it, you get caught up in this thing where you learn that you're a magical girl, and apparently the ghost of murderers who have power equivalent to how many people they killed before they themselves were executed, have come back from the dead through some sort of dark ritual, and you now as a magical girl need to go and put these spirits to rest and try and find out what happened to your mom and stop this evil dark guy who actually transforms his look multiple times in the game. The Dark Lord character actually has some designs that look legitimately creepy. And then at the very end, he settles on the most hilarious design he could have settled on. I don't know how to describe it, and I'm terrible with names, so excuse me for this. But the final form, the final boss in Clock Tower 3, to me, reminded me of the main villain in Pocahontas. the clothes they was wearing were incredibly similar to the main villain of Pocahontas. Anyways, that I know it's a weird comparison point. However, to touch a little bit more on base on that, Clock Tower 3's game design. Despite all this, though, Clock Tower 3 is actually pretty fun. I actually think it's more fun than Clock Tower 1 and 2. And it's not just because it's funnier, I just think that Clock Tower 1 and 2, despite being very interesting games, are plagued by a lot of really weird design decisions that kind of don't deter the enjoyment of them. But also, keep in mind, though, I might have a bias here, by which I mean I most definitely have a bias, because I have a hard time getting the point and clicks. And I wish I didn't have that sort of aversion to the genre. It's not that I disenjoy them, it's just I can't seem to be as easily to get into them as just full control of the character. I think a big part of it has to do with the exploration factor and how the exploration works. I love exploring in games, and point and clicks, while you do explore in point and clicks, how you explore them is different than how you explore in a more fluid character movement game. I also do not enjoy pixel perfect times. That's just me, though. Okay. So talking more about Clock Tower 3 here in game design, Clock Tower 3 is kind of interesting because how they designed each of the levels is actually tremendously different. And I'm not going to talk about every single location in the game, because if I did that for every single game, this would get tiring. But I think that the most interesting parts of the game was strangely the middle section. I think that the house sewer section... Sewers are usually not the most interesting part of a game. I think many would disagree with me to say that part's interesting, but I found it interesting due to a few things. And the following sequence inside the hospital were very interesting cases of horror game design and did some things that you don't really see very often even in this current day and age. So, Clock Tower 3 is not strictly a fixed camera horror game. It uses fixed camera angles sometimes, but mainly the camera sort of tracks you, sort of like a Silent Hill-esque camera, except for specific moments where you sort of tread off and the camera switches. What they do in the sewer location is that there's this new villain that chases you, who has two hatchets, can throw hatchets and all that. And they did something which is kind of cheap, but the game's kind of hilarious, so it's not annoying, it's kind of more endearing, but it works well. Where essentially when the camera switches, like when you're going around the corner and the camera would switch, the killer would then have a chance of showing up. So when the camera perspective changed, there'd be a boom sound, and then the music for the chaser would start playing. In fact, give me a second. So let's talk about fucking Clock Tower 3. I love the boss battle theme of Clock Tower 3, so I'm gonna find this boss battle theme, and I'm gonna play it because I love the boss battle theme of Clock Tower 3. It's fucking great. It's the theme that plays when you have to defeat the evil killers from being your goal as a magical girl. Let me get this out right now. Clock Tower 3 boss theme. Put that on loop for a little bit. I'm not going to talk about Clock Tower 3 too long, so I can just like take this one. There it is. Okay, so they do this sort of interesting thing that so whenever the camera changes inside of the sewer section of Clock Tower 3, the villain just magically appears and starts chasing you, which is surprisingly effective. And you don't really see too many horror games, even in the fixed camera variety, that really utilize their fixed camera-ness to sort of do a jump scare, which is strange, actually. It's very strange. In fact, one of the more effective jump scares of Resident Evil 3 utilizes something similar, but in a different way. But it's surprisingly rare. I've played, no joke, several dozen fixed camera horror games at this point in my life. I've played most of them that existed on the PS1, and working through all of them that were through on the PS2 here. And you don't see it very often, which is strange because it seems like a perfect fit. The one example from Resident Evil 3 which I can think of off the top is the very famous Nemesis window jump scare moment, which if you haven't played Resident Evil 3 in a while or never played it, there's this scene where you go back to the RPD police station, the location from Resident Evil 2, and you go to the STARS office, and then you're backtracking in your way to leave the building, and there's a moment where the camera is pointed down some stairs towards a window. and you sort of run down the stairs and the camera stays here, and then you run past the window to go out the way that you came here previously, but then the camera switches as soon as you walk past the window, and as soon as the camera changes, the camera is zoomed in close to the window. It's like positioned at the bottom of the stairs you just ran down, and it's positioned down the hallway you're about to go down, but then as soon as the camera switches, Nemesis breaks through the window and his towering form is sort of blocking your camera, which is a pretty scary moment, and it's one of the very few examples I can think of where they utilized a fixed camera angle change to be tied into a jump scare. But outside of that, and this moment in Clock Tower 3, which involves a killer that has a random chance of showing up when the camera perspective changes, you don't actually see that very, very often, despite the fact it seems like it'd be something that would be built for the fixed camera format. I'm not saying I want to... If it was overdone, it would be fucking annoying, but it's just something which I thought was a little bit fascinating that one wasn't used more than it was. In fact, there's a lot of tricks with the fixed camera angle, which I don't really think they ever fully utilized or used to the best of their ability. I think the fixed camera angles died a little bit too soon to be able to pursue some of the more interesting possibilities with them. We'll talk about that when we talk about it, though. To go a little bit more in depth about Clock Tower 3, though, the other interesting chapter which I have a strange affinity for is the hospital chapter. And at that point in the game, you're getting chased by two stalkers, the scissor people of the game, because every Clock Tower game is a scissor stalker. In this game, they're a pair of twins that look pretty silly, honestly. There's a female scissor man and a male scissor man, and the scissor twins. And they chase you around, but the hospital does an interesting thing where there's these mirrors where you can sort of transfer your soul or something between two different versions of the hospital. There's like two versions that have differences between each other, and something that you do in one hospital will affect the other. However, one of the twins stalks one half the hospital, while the other twin stalks the other half. And it's kind of an interesting play on how Silent Hill earlier than Clock Tower 3 did its other worlds. Silent Oranges later would more fully utilize this, because the Silent Hill Oranges, I call it its origins, but I just enjoy calling it Oranges. They utilized a similar mechanic, actually, where you go through mirrors to go between the normal Silent Hill version, like, not normal, but like foggy version of Silent Hill, and the otherworld versions, and something to do in one or the other would affect the other. I wonder if they were inspired by Clock Tower 3. But this chapter of Clock Tower 3 does it where you sort of switch between these two different versions of the hospital, which I should mention, outside of other differences, the two places are like kind of the same except mirrored to each other. Like there's a sort of normal version and then there's a mirrored version. Anyways, let's see what you wrote here before I continue. That should be reevaluated, introduced again to fixed camera horror games going forward. The way you're also talking about it is entertaining. I'm happy. I don't know how entertaining I am. I am exhausted right now, so I'm hoping that I'm at least comprehensible. I said that completely wrong, but okay. Anyways, but I think that fixed camera angles kind of went out the door before they were fully utilized, and I think that the hospital design was kind of interesting. Oranges, Silent Hill Oranges, did touch on it later, but I don't really think that they fully utilized the possibility of either scenario, and they both have interesting possibilities. Both the interesting take on the sort of the fixed camera angle scare, and just sort of a monster that can randomly appear tied to the fixed camera angle switching. But the other thing as well is that the hospital idea, though it was used later in Oranges, I just kind of like the concept of two parallel spaces they can sort of hop between. Not really, though, for they could work. Again, I guess, you know, you could say like Link to the Past kind of did that. Legend of Zelda game, of course, is what I'm talking about. But all the same. Is there anything else I want to say about Clock Tower 3 specifically? The boss battles in Clock Tower 3, I don't really want to talk fully in depth about them, but they're kind of simple but endearing. You have this charged up bow and arrow, and it's kind of an interesting way to tackle a boss battle in that game. The boss battles, outside of the last one being maybe a little bit too hard, they were entertaining. Not super difficult except for the last one, but they were nice little breathers in between everything else. They weren't like doing the same thing over and over again. Yeah, I guess... Oh, also, one last thing. Clock Tower 3, kinda... When I say kinda, I use that term very, very broadly. For the first half of the game, there's kind of a hub location that you return to, which it did this idea before Silent Hill 4 and Fatal Frame 3 utilized a similar idea. I am fascinated by the sort of horror game with different levels, but has a central hub world that you return to. Clock Tower 3 didn't really fully utilize this idea, but it kinda used it at a few site sequences, so. And I'm not sure if it's the first game that utilized any idea that was strictly like that. I mean, you could say, for example, you could say like the town of Silent Hill in Silent Hill 1 could be counted as that, but I don't really consider that to be the same thing. It's kind of, because this town of Silent Hill kind of continuously changes in between the different versions that you play it as to suit the needs of the gameplay and sort of still transverse the town of Silent Hill in this very linear part, and it's less of like a hubby area, more of just like a breather in between going through the main chapters of the game. They're more like breather breaks than they are like hub areas, I would say. They do interconnect the game and make it feel more like a living, breathing place, but all the same. I need to refill my water. Unfortunately, I'm thirsty and kind of drank it all already. Let's see, I'm not going to make you guys listen to the boss theme, though, for another loop. Was there another... Okay, yeah, I know I'll make you... We're going to talk about Haunting Ground next, and I guess I'll make you guys listen to one of the more memorable songs from Haunting Ground. It's not going to take me long to get my water, so 1 second. Haunting Ground, the sound like Final Castle Escape. It's actually playing through some different Stalker themes because there's several throughout the game, but all the same. Yep, it's called Dementio in Japan, and, well, Demento I think is what it is actually. Dementio, something like that. Let's see. It's one of the alternative names to the title. It was a great horror game. Yes, it was. In fact, I'm a little bit sad that this game failed miserably. I am happy with the reality I live in, but I would have loved to live in a reality where Haunting Ground was a success when we got a sequel to it. But it wasn't. It was a failure, so let's talk about it. 1 second, though. Okay. So talk about Haunting Ground. In my opinion, by far the best of the Clock Tower-esque games. It took sort of the silliness of Clock Tower 3, but the sort of entertaining gameplay, and spun into this very fascinating piece because it is actually, scary isn't the right word, but It has a much better atmosphere than the other games. And alongside this, it also has, I think, the best story, the best setting, the most interesting characters, has the most interesting in-depth gameplay mechanics of the franchise. I think it was like the best realized version of Haunting, like of the Clock Tower formula, which is a shame. And don't apologize to the spam. I completely appreciate it, because then, you know, it's something to respond to here, and that's a-okay. In fact, I appreciate it, so know that. Okay, but anyways, Haunting Ground. If I wanted to, and if I refreshed myself on everything about Haunting Ground, I could, like, sit here for a long time talking about this game, because Haunting Ground is something which is a type of game design I adore, but you don't see very often. It kind of exists in every horror game, but there's some games that nail this aspect, which if a game can nail this aspect, I'm most likely going to fall in love with it. The horror games that sort of utilize where every room has sort of this artistic quality that is absolutely fascinating and interesting. Because in Haunting Ground, every room in the game has a thematic, it has sort of a personality to it, which makes exploring the game incredibly interesting, because even as you're being chased and all that, you're running through all these absolutely fascinating locations, and you sort of get a good feel for where you are, because everywhere has something that sort of stands out about it. Good examples, it's like even in the first area where you're getting chased, there's the library room, there's the checkered hallway place, which is where the doll is, there's the golem room, which has all of the witchcraft or magic stuff, there's the room that's all torn up and shredded and the fallen down chandelier, there's the room with the creepy pregnant statue in it and those bookshelves they can knock over, which also has classical music playing in it. There's the child's room, which is, I believe his name is Civilitus's room, where there's all these dolls and toys and a crib and all sorts, and the rocking horse and all that all sold in. There's the main hall, which has this extravagant staircase and carpet and knights in armor and all that all around. There's the bug room, which is all these bugs positioned all around the room, and all these sort of moths that are flying all across the room, and some are clustering around this area blocking the door. I could go on and on and on, but the game has all these sort of fascinating things that stick out about a room, and there's something about game design which I forget where I heard this from. Somebody told this to me once upon a time, and it really kind of stuck with me. There's a type of game design where the thing that is important, or something that's kind of important in terms of game design, to know if you made an interesting area, even just an interesting room or not, is if a player can describe the room to somebody else, and just by limited descriptions, they can know exactly what they're talking about. Now, that seems like something that's super easy to overlook, but like, here's a great example. In a lot of games, think about like different games that you either like or dislike, and think about how each area or level in the game, if they have unique characteristics that you can sort of tell them apart from one another. Even if the game is like kind of similar, like, let's talk Super Mario Bros. For an example. There are some levels of Super Mario Bros. Now, Super Mario Bros. It's a little bit unfair to pick on certain things about it, because obviously it's like the game that rejuvenated video games, and of course it had to create a lot of its own rules to do that. However, Super Mario Bros. Does have some levels that stand out far more than others, and there's some levels that sort of falter because they don't really have any characteristics to fully define them. So a lot of times it's just easier to refer to them as things like 1-1, 1-3, etc., etc. While later Mario games utilize so that each level and sort of area has its own unique characteristics and themings that make it fascinating to talk about. I'm thinking about, I guess since I'm talking about this specific topic, Haunting Ground excels in this area where if I was to try and describe a room to you, each room has several unique characteristics, so that I could describe it as that one room with the pregnant doll thing and the several bookshelves all lined up in the way where that creepy guy talks to you, and you probably know what I'm talking about if you've either played or seen the game. And I could do that from nearly any room in the game, and you would sort of know what I was talking about, because each room has several interesting characteristics. If a level has nothing interesting that stands out in the mind, then it's most likely just not a very interesting level, because there's nothing that really stands out in a person's mind when they think about it. Because if they're trying to recall or trying to talk about this specific area, there's just nothing particularly interesting about it to make it stand out in the person's mind. But if there's even just a single interesting thing about it which they want to talk about, or even possibly multiple things to sort of stick out in the mind when they're talking about it, and the others can pick up on, then that's a sign that there was information and interesting design choices shared to make it so that it still stands out in a person's mind even after not playing the game for a while or something like that. It's sort of a weird thing, and I'm not sure if I portrayed that the best I could have, thinking I guess I am exhausted right now. But I hope that's kind of an interesting thing to think about. So much I think it's interesting to think about at the very least. But all the same, Haunted Ground has this sort of design, and there are sections of the game which I think are fantastic. And one of the purest examples I can give this, a lot of people's favorite stalker in the game is Daniela. And part of that is definitely her personality, her appearance, and a lot of things about her. Her motives for wanting to hunt down Fiona are probably the creepiest of the stalkers. Like, okay, in fact, the theme that's playing right now is probably he has the creepiest motive, but not the most interesting motive. I think Daniela has the most interesting motive. The other stalkers all have their own sort of interesting motives as well, and they're all interesting stalkers, just Daniela sort of stands out from the pack because she seems like the most crazy. Ricardo, whose theme is playing right now, is the creepiest, but he doesn't really seem as crazy as Daniela does. And Daniela also has a huge buff to her, which I think plays a lot on why people remember her the most. Outside of her appearance, outside of her personality, the thing which I think makes Daniela stand out a lot actually has to do with the area that she stalks you in. Out of all the stalkers, Daniela, I think, has by far the most interesting variety of rooms that she chases you through. Daniela chases you through my personal favorite segment of Haunted Ground, which is an area which is structured with all of these absolutely fascinating areas. There's the bathroom that is submerged underwater, by which I mean that the bathroom itself isn't like flooded. It's just that it is surrounded by these giant windows, and you're like underneath a lake, and a fucking whale can pass by the window, and it's just fascinating to be inside a bathroom where you're just kind of like surrounded by these giant glass walls that show that you are completely underwater wherever this bathroom would be. And then there's the room with the really creepy, the singular, it's not a lot of dolls, but a singular, really creepy, detailed maid doll that's kind of slumped over in a chair. And there's other, like, really fascinating rooms, like there's the sort of graveyardish room where all the graves are dug up, or there's the fucking dragon room, or there's this fire and ice dragon thing that's making this sort of spiral thing. I can go on. I'm not going to try and describe every fucking room in Haunted Ground at the moment, but I think that also not only is the rooms interesting, but how they intersect is interesting. In the first area of Haunted Ground, there are multiple paths to run through, but there's a lot of parts that are, like a lot of rooms in the first main area of Haunted Ground. For those who don't know, Haunted Ground is sort of split into areas. You are kind of traveling through a singular area with a single stalker until you sort of reach the end of the location, have a boss battle with them, and then once you defeat the boss, you sort of get the key item you need to go and unlock the next major location. The major locations are kind of big, actually. Each one is probably composed of somewhere between like 30 to 50 rooms to sort of traverse. Maybe that's a little bit extravagant. It's probably more like 20 to 40 or something like that, but there's still a lot of rooms to sort of run through, and in the, no, 2050 is actually correct. I was thinking about it for a second. The first area you have is not badly designed by any stretch of the imagination, but there's not nearly as many paths as you would think there should be. The stalker's kind of dumber in the area, so it works out fine. There's a lot of ways to sort of distract him. But there's a lot of areas where you have to sort of run in these straight lines. There's a ton of dead ends everywhere, like a lot of rooms that sort of just are dead ends, and you sort of circle around in them. It's good for teaching the player how to think about their pathways as they're traveling, because if they travel in a bad way, they're going to end up in a trickier position. But it's still the actual branching pathways. The location is kind of like split into two squares. There's like these two squares that kind of loop into each other. There's a couple pathways that sort of lead into some other sections and areas, and quite a few dead ends around those two squares, but it's kind of a simply designed location. While the second main location in the game, I believe, actually has the best design, because the area is contained enough and has enough of a flow of pacing through it to let you more explore this location. But it has more branching pathways, and like each room usually has more doors to allow you to more plan your route while you're being chased, which is important because the game, keep in mind, is a clock tower-esque game, which means that there is a lot of chase sequences. There's a lot of moments where you have to very quickly decide what pathway you want to take and what you're trying to head towards. Like, if you're trying to head towards a hiding spot that you know exists, or if you're trying to find some item to use to fend off Daniela for a second. Speaking of which, Daniela is a very interesting tidbit, which I'll talk about in just a second. But also there's multiple, like, routes that you can plot out and plan. You can become more familiar with the location and plot more strategically. So when you're facing Daniela, there's a lot more strategy in how you sort of handle and deal with her because of the fact that her location that you face her off in has a lot more possibilities and routes and pathways. And the hiding spots are a little bit more spaced out than they were in the first location. I should mention that about the first location. Even though there's a lot of dead ends, a lot of the dead ends in the first area has hiding spots everywhere, so you're pretty much fine a lot of the time. However, to talk about this, there are also advantages that Daniela has, one of which is something which is kind of a secret trigger, where some hiding spots or certain events that you can trigger with her will put Daniela into a rage mode, which is to say that Daniela has two potential forms that she could be chasing you at. There's her default form, where she kind of walks at a fast pace towards you. But if you do certain things with your time with Daniela, I forget what it is that you do exactly, but I think you like burn her or break something, and for some reason that enrages her. And she takes this fire poker and puts in the fire, and she starts running instead of just fast walking. And that makes her a lot harder to escape from if you trigger her rage mode, and she stays in the rage mode until you really until you beat the area. But just a little bit of a thing I remember is that she's the only stalker that has a like second phase you can optionally opt into. But of course, opting into it's interesting, but of course it makes your playthrough a lot harder if you're dealing with the second phase Daniela. The third location that follows this, Ricardo. For starters, I like Ricardo as a villain, but he's a little bit annoying to deal with because he's the only stalker in the game with a gun. And, you know, you don't have any weapons outside of Huey, so a villain with a gun is kind of tricky. But also, the area he chases you in, it's not, like, too much bigger than the other locations, but it's kind of big and very labyrinthy. Something that got to the point where it became, at least when I played it, may have already played that experience differently, but when I played Haunting Ground, when I got to Ricardo's section, I kind of just got through it through blind luck, because the area was a lot harder to memorize on the go, especially when you're being chased rapidly by this maniac with a gun who's trying to shoot you. Because there was so many different routes and places to go, and there was so much going on so quickly that it was a little bit hard for me to sort of memorize sort of the location I was running through. Not saying that the rooms I wasn't running through were interesting, though. There was definitely some standout things that were sticking out as I ran through them. Okay. Is there too much more I want to say about Haunting Ground? The boss battles in Haunting Ground are kind of interesting. I'm not really a fan of the first one, to be honest. The first one is, there's two ways you can beat the first boss. You either stick Huey on him a lot and kill him eventually, or you break a chandelier on him. It's really hard to make him break the chandelier on him because you have to lure him to these sides of the rooms and flail on these like side things that will break a chandelier on him and make him live, but leave you alone. I don't know, I didn't really like the first boss battle that much. The other ones were pretty enjoyable. Ricardo's boss battle had some annoyances to it. Daniela's boss battle was actually probably the best one in the game outside. Daniela's boss battle was the best in the game. I thought about it from again for a second. I didn't mind the final boss battle, but some of the stuff about it was a little bit tricky to figure out, like kicking the stones into the magma was a little bit tricky to figure out, but all the same. It makes more sense if you're playing the game. But anyways, is there anything else I really want to say about Haunting Ground right now? I could sit here for hours talking about the pacing of the game and design here if I refreshed myself on it, but again, keep in mind this is me sort of breezing over a lot of talking points. I have been up for a long time, exhausted. I'm happy because I'm starting to feel my sleepiness kicking a little bit more, but I think I can talk more than just the fucking clock tower games. But that means, what do I want to talk about? I did have this PS1, PS2 list, and I started with Clock Tower because it's the first thing listed here. Apparently I had a lot to say, but I still have a lot more I could be saying. Alright. So after that, the next game that I've played is D. I don't really have a lot to say about D, though. I still also need to beat Enemy Zero, because I ran into an emulation bug and I did play it previously. And I need to play D2 at some point. D was interesting. It's a CG horror game made by Kenji Eno, who I have absolute respect for. In fact, I have so much respect for him. I'm going to play one of his songs right now. Enemy Zero OST is Enemy Zero OST is fucking amazing, by the way, if you never heard it. In fact, I'm going to play it right now. He actually composed most of the music for Enemy Zero too, and it's an amazing soundtrack. It's actually up there as one of my favorites. Now I'm going to talk about Kenji Eno. This has nothing to do with game design. Okay. There are a couple horror game developers that died in spookingly similar ways, and I am incredibly sad about their deaths. They're not hugely known, but I think a lot of people who are horror enthusiasts have heard of their titles, or even potentially of them, because their titles had enough personality that they really stood out. And I'm just incredibly sad. Both of them died in their 40s. They both died at almost the exact same age. In fact, they did die at the exact same age. I think they both died at 42, and both of them died due to heart failure. Both were Japanese developers. The people I'm talking about is, firstly here, get this set up. I want to make sure I get their names right here and not like mess it up here, so I'm going to sort of look into it. I'm pretty sure the first one, yeah, it's Kenji Eno. Kenji Eno, the creator of the D trilogy. He created other games, I'll touch on them a bit here. But the second one was the creator of Illbleed and Blue Steiner, which I need to remember his name right now because I'm terrible with names. Let's see. There it is. Nishigaki. Yeah, they both died at 42 of heart failure, and his name was Shinya Nishigaki. So to talk about first the D trilogy, and then I guess about Illbleed and Blue Steiner. Keep in mind I have not played all the way through Enemy Zero. I've played a couple hours on Enemy Zero, but I got into this really annoying bug because I was playing the Sega Saturn version through emulation. I had the disc. There might be something wrong with my disc. In fact, that has a very high chance of being correct because I was actually playing through my disc when I was playing it. But there was, now I'm afraid that my disc was like scratched or something. God. But I got to this moment in the game where it would get to this line of dialogue and start looping infinitely. And now the line that I got stuck on every single time is kind of hilarious, but it's not fun to play a game for a couple hours to get to this point where you can't continue because it just keeps on looping on the same bit of dialogue whenever you reach it. And it was really funny how it looped, actually. I'm going to have to share it. It essentially was a permanent loop. The game would freeze up and loop at this one guy saying over and over again on repeat because I got stuck here. You look a bit dazed. You look a bit dazed. You look a bit dazed. And it was kind of funny. But, touching on that, the D trilogy was made by Kenji Eno. And Kenji Eno, I think, had a real eye for interesting game design perspectives. He was one of the first developers. In fact, I think he was the first, but someone's going to have to correct me if I'm wrong about this. Hello, Jaded. Kenji Eno was a developer who created the first game for a blind person. He released it for the Dreamcast. It was a game that lacked any sort of visuals and tried to use sound entirely for its design. A few games have done that in the more recent years in the indie scene, and some to very good effect, but Kenji Eno originally made that game because he received a letter from a fan of his who played Enemy Zero, and Enemy Zero, if you don't know, is this one horror game they made previously, which has this interesting hook where the enemies in the game are all invisible. And you have this gun that can shoot a single shot that can kill any enemy it hits, but once you shot a shot off, it takes like about 20 seconds to recharge. So you have to sort of strategize and figure out where the invisible enemies are based on their audio placement. Like, you have to rely on the sound design of the game to sort of locate them, and it can be surprisingly nerve-wracking. It's an interesting little design bit, and that's a lot about Kenji Eno that you'll learn, is he has a lot of interesting ideas in game design, which is partially why I kind of want to talk about him, because I think that even though a lot of his games had issues, they had a ton of personality. But to talk a little bit further on that, he got a letter from a blind fan who said that, basically writing to him how he really liked Enemy Zero. he couldn't play too many games because, of course, he can't see. But Enemy Zero is one of the games that he could manage to play because it was a game where the sound design was so good that even though he couldn't, and because it was already based around visible enemies and all that, because you couldn't, and because they designed the game so you could sort of hear yourself, you could hear into walls, and you could hear where the enemies were and everything, that you could actually play through the entire game because of the sound design of the game. Even though he was blind and couldn't see what was going on in the game, he was very appreciative of that. And receiving that letter, Kenji Eno was very touched by it and thought about making a game for the Dreamcast that had no visuals and could just be entirely played through sound design, which is kind of the story behind that one. However, he's most famous for the D trilogy, which was composed of D, which is a Sega Saturn, I believe PS1, yeah, it was definitely PS1, and PC game. Then there was Enemy Zero, which was a Sega Saturn, PC, I don't remember, yeah, I didn't release on PS1. In fact, there was a really... Kenji Eno, talking about him, was sort of a rock star game developer. One of his most famous, quote-unquote, rock star moves is that he went to Sony's E3 conference in the 90s, and you can actually look this up. There's a clip of this on YouTube in this day and age. But he did one of the biggest fuck yous in the industry. Essentially, he had a sour experience with Sony, and he appeared at the Sony E3 conference in the late 90s, and he was going to announce D2, but however though, when he let the D2 trailer play to get people's interest at the conference, and at the end of the trailer, there was a thing at the end which just said exclusive to the Sega Dreamcast, and he essentially afterwards had to be forced off the stage because he was given a big fuck you to Sony on the stage, which is fascinating, and could definitely not happen in the current day and age of the gaming industry, but I think it was a little interesting little bit there. He has some very interesting views about games. If you ever read interviews with Kenji Eno, he had a very rock star personality thing. And yes, for those who don't know, D2 was a Dreamcast exclusive there. Yeah, he died way too soon. He had a lot of interesting ideas, like between the D trilogy, one of his ideas was that each game had a separate story. Like D, Enemy Zero, and D2 all share completely separate stories that have nothing in common. Also, their gameplay is entirely different. The first D game is a completely CG motion capture game. It's an FMV game where you solve puzzles and all that. And you're also on a time limit, so you have to beat the game before like the portal closes. It has to account Dracula. It's a very strange game. You can find D on Steam. It's actually my least favorite between D and Enemy Zero. Enemy Zero is the invisible enemy game I was just talking about, and D2 is a game that's set in the harsh Arctic of Canada. And a airplane crashes after a strange meteorite hits the Earth, and all these strange monsters start showing up. And there's some survival gameplay where you have to hunt for food, like hunt for rabbits and all that in the Canadian wasteland. I'm making jokes here, but really the game has it designed so it's like this waste, like they just pick Canada as the snowy wasteland, and I think it's kind of funny. But anyways, and I've heard the story of that game gets bonkers, so I tried not to spoil it for myself. All the music that you're hearing is from Enemy Zero, by the way. But anyways, if you read interviews by him, he's a very fascinating character, and I'm a little bit sad that he passed away so soon. He passed away in, I believe it was 2012 or 2013, at the age of 42, and it's a real shame that he passed away, because I think that he had a very unique voice, and though all of his games are kind of rough, I'm going to be honest with you on that one. But they're very endearing, I think, because they have a lot of personality behind them. I didn't finish my thought earlier. Even though those three games I mentioned earlier, D, Enemy Zero, and D2, don't have any sort of story connection, he had this idea that characters could be like quote-unquote actors. So all three games star this exact same character. She looks exactly the same in all three games, named Laura. And all the side characters, not all of them, but a lot of the side characters are reoccurring between all three games. But they're not the same character. They only look the same and have the same voice actors. But they're essentially playing, and they even have the same names, but they're just playing different roles, if that makes any sense. It's kind of a strange thought, but I thought that was interesting. I've never really seen any other game try that, so... And that's a lot of the things that he did do. He tried experimenting a lot with how games kind of worked as a medium, and different sort of game design stuff that weren't tried back when he tried them. ranging from, of course, the game that a blind person can play, which is inspired by a letter, to the idea that a game is full of invisible enemies, and you have a gun that slowly charges, and you have to sort of base where they are based on the sound, and lots of other things. But again, I really need to finish playing Enemy Zero at some point and actually play through D2, but I have a lot of respect for him. And there's another developer that's very similar to him who I have a lot of respect for. Unfortunately, his name I don't remember. Kenji Eno, for some reason, his name is stuck with me, but the other one's name I always forget. Despite the fact I have a lot of respect for him. Senyan Shigaki. And I can actually talk more about him because I've played both of his most notable games. So, Shinya Nagashiki, he was the director behind Blue Steiner and Illbleed, both of which were Dreamcast horror games. I believe those were the only two games he worked on, but I'm going to check. Yep, yeah, those were the only two games he worked on. He did work on Landstalker, I guess, but that's a other story for another time. Yeah, okay. Does he not have his own page? That's gonna make me sad if he doesn't. Well, anyways, talking about this. If you never played Blue Steiner or Illbleed, both of them are morbidly fascinating. In fact, now this is the right time to play this next song. The next song I'm gonna play is called Merry Christmas from Blue Steiner. So, this is another director whose games were very flawed. Both of them, both Blue Steiner and Illbleed, have a lot of issues, but they're very original and are very, very endearing. And I'll talk a little about that one right now. Blue Steiner is a bit more of a Resident Evil clone than Illbleed is. Illbleed is incredibly original, but I'll talk about Blue Steiner first. In fact, fun fact, Blue Steiner... Okay, so... Blue Steiner is a game that's supposed to be set during Christmas of 2018. So, like, literally on the day of Christmas 2018. In Blue Steiner, a meteorite hits the Earth, and all these, not dinosaurs, but dinosaur-like things come out of the Earth. They're like weird dino mutants, and they're like a zombie thing where they can infect people to turn them into dinosaur mutants. It's kind of strange, I know. So what I'm basically saying is that the mutant dinosaur apocalypse is coming for us in like less than a month, so everyone get ready. But more seriously, I'm going to put this little song on loop for a second. The game managed to somehow get a orchestrated soundtrack, and I don't really know how they managed to get it. I think it might have to do with the fact that this game, Blue Steiner, was a Dreamcast launch game, actually. To talk a bit more about it in depth, there's an interesting thing about Blue Steiner as well. In Japan, the game has like fixed camera angles like a Resident Evil game. But they thought that Western audiences wouldn't receive the fixed camera angles as well, so in America, it doesn't have fixed camera angles because the environments weren't pre-rendered, they were all rendered in 3D. So instead, you have this sort of janky third-person camera, which I played the American version. It works, but I'd be interested at some point to play the fixed camera angle version. Anyways, Blue Steiner is a really bizarre game. It's on this island. You play as this one character. Talking about how Blue Steiner is a really bizarre game is hard to touch upon because how it's weird is really weird. It's got like this almost Universal Studios movie feel. Something about the director of Blue Steiner and Illbleed, to get to his name again, Shinya Nishigaki, is that he really, really liked movies. Like, his father used to own a movie store, and he used to watch movies all the time. He grew up watching movies and having full access to this movie store, and he became familiar with a lot of Western film and Japanese film and all of that, and he absolutely adored the world of movies. To the point that you'd think he wanted to become a movie director, but he got sort of attached to this idea of interactive games that in the form of movies. So, Blue Steiner is the first example of this. If you play Blue Steiner, you can absolutely see where he's trying to make it feel like it's particularly a Steven Spielberg or Universal Studios film. The story is unfortunately not good enough to stand up to those, but it's very endearing in a lot of ways. They try a lot of interesting sort of character arcs with the characters, lots of weird, bizarre scenes. There's a lot of really weird stuff in this. The song that's playing right now plays in this Christmas shopping district level, which goes on for a little bit too long, if I'm going to be honest with you, but It's fascinating because you're listening to the song for hours. It kind of gets ingrained in your head as you go through these Christmas shopping centers with these giant Megazord dinosaur things. This is a really hard game to describe. There's a blue fairy in Blue Steiner. I'm sorry, it's just so random for me to say. But yes, there's a blue fairy in Blue Steiner who kind of plays a big role in the story. The final boss of Blue Steiner is a kaiju monster. There's this pirate guy. It's like this very... There's... Okay, this is gonna sound weird, but just kind of stick with me for a second. There is a black man pirate who is kind of your best friend in the game. And I'm not... Oh, wait, I forgot to mention the weirdest thing. If you've ever played Sonic Adventure 2... I know, Sonic Adventure 2 is a weird comparison, but it's going to make sense in a second. If you've ever played Sonic Adventure 2, the really weird thing about Blue Steiner is that almost all the Sonic Adventure 2 voice actors are in it. The main character is voiced by the person who plays Sonic in Sonic Adventure 1 and 2. And then the black pirate I'm talking about was voiced by Eggman's voice actor before he passed away, unfortunately, too. And then there's a main female character who's voiced by Rouge the Bat's voice actor. And they all sound just like their video game. It sounds like Eggman playing on, like the Sonic Adventure 2 Eggman playing on a pirate accent and Sonic talking weirdly because of weird Japanese voice acting direction. It's very bizarre if you're familiar with those voice actors. But anyways, to move away from that, that's part of the oddness of this game, is what I should mention there. However, to go a little bit further with it, there's a lot of weird scenes. Like, there's a scene where the main character and the black pirate guy get naked and go inside into a hot spring and talk about slime, I think? It was something weird like that. And it's just kind of weird to listen to Sonic and Dr. Eggman's voice actors talk about taking a dip in the tub while talking about slime together. It's like, what? I don't know. There's some weird dissonance of experience and stuff like that. And there's also lots of other weird scenes. Like there's this part where your character gets infected with I call it the Spyro virus, because you turn into like this entity that kind of looks like a mixture between the main character fused with Spider-Man, fused with Spyro the Dragon, and you get like crawl on walls during this sequence, and you have these monster attacks because you're like half dragon, half spider, and half human, and you crawl along and do all this freakish stuff, and you start losing your ability to speak, so it's just all these guttural noises that come out of your mouth as you try to talk to characters, and the other characters, your good old pirate friend, tries to save you. This game is really weird, and it's really hard to express why it's weird. It's just very, very strange. But it's very endearingly strange. It's a game where it's kind of fascinating just to go through to see what the fuck this game's gonna throw at you next, because it throws all sorts of really weird bullshit at you, and it's all very, very fascinating, and by the time I finished that, I found myself very endeared to the game. Not between, like, entering a Christmas-themed military facility into this supercomputer full of literal, like, living computer bugs that also happen to be dinosaurs for some reason. And an area that was very obviously a ripoff of the Death Star in Star Wars, except put into this weird Christmas-themed dinosaur wonderland. It's very strange to see Velociraptor ripoffs running off of a ripoff of the Death Star. It's very, again, this game is very strange, and to express why it's so strange, it's kind of hard to. You'd have to sort of play it to get what I'm touching on, I think. Illbleed, however, was a lot stranger than that game, by like a huge margin. If you've never heard of Illbleed, let me see if I can touch on this one here for a fucking second. Illbleed, voila, voila. I'm gonna play the trailer for it because the trailer dialogue is pretty hilarious. Illbleed tried to be a B-horror game. Not just one B-horror game, it tried to be multiple B-horror games in a single game. If you've never played Illbleed, it is about this amusement park that whoever can get through all the attractions in the amusement park to the end will win $1 million. And so we joined a group of teens who all got past Illbleed to try and win $1 million in the Fear theme park. However, the theme park is just an excuse to set up all these B horror movie settings. There are like 6 different attractions you have to go through, and then the final one. And they're all set after really weird B horror movie plots. Like the first one that you go through features a hotel. It features a dad who really wanted his son, whose name is Jimmy, to get into baseball. He was so obsessed with Jimmy getting into baseball that he built an underground baseball ring beneath the hotel that he ran. Billy wasn't apparently very into baseball, but his dad was super persuasive into this. Until one day, where some dumb teenagers who are been picking on, I'm saying Billy, I think, but I mean Jimmy, who've been picking on Jimmy, come to torture him with, I remember there's a plot point here I'm forgetting, but they eventually burn down the hotel, and Jimmy dies, and the father survives but gets disfigured and turns into this slasher horror movie killer who hates teens, because they killed Jimmy and his son and his dreams of Jimmy to become a baseball player. And because he's like half melted, like his body is deformed and all that, he uses a blowtorch. It's called a blowtorch, but more accurately it's like a flamethrower to try and burn you and other people down because you're a teenager trying to survive. But also because he was obsessed with baseball, he's got this weird baseball theme. So already it's starting to get a little bit strange because you got this half melted killer who has like this flamethrower baseball thematic. So that's kind of strange. But then add to this also the hotel thing I mentioned earlier. So he's got this weird check-in thing in the hotel saying, and his son comes back from the dead as a giant. I don't know why his son comes back as a giant. He just does. He comes out from a lake, even though he burnt. I don't fucking know. It's very strange. That's not even the weirdest of the plot lines. The plot lines get very strange, and they do this interesting thing where the whole entire game is taking B horror movie plots, making them playable sequences. Though the gameplay is very strange. I'm going to touch on that one in a second. But because it's an amusement park, there's some things that are kind of played up. Like there's a sequence in the game where there's supposed to be a boss battle, but something breaks among the amusement park stuff, and the boss battle breaks because the boss is supposed to be beatable because it is an amusement park attraction, but they accidentally, the behind the scenes, because there's some weird scenes in Illbleed where you see the people working behind the scenes trying to get these attractions working. But they're having some difficulties, some technical difficulties. One of the technical difficulties is that they unfortunately make it so that the boss's health isn't registering. And at first they play it off like you're running into a game bug. Like for some reason our boss isn't taking any damage. It's like, what am I supposed to do and all that? But then in the middle of the boss fight, it transitions into this cutscene about behind the scenes where they're having technical difficulties with the boss's controls and computer wireframe, where for some reason the boss that's supposed to be beatable is stuck in some sort of programming loop where it's looping its health so that it keeps on refilling to be unbeatable. And they're like, well, it's not fair if we have an attraction that has literally no win state. And then during the boss battle, you go back to playing, and there's these technical engineers that come in and trying to fix the boss battle as things are going haywire. There's a lot of really weird things like that in Illbleed, and it's very endearing. The strangest chapter in the game, and what most people fucking remember if they have played Illbleed, because this is the chapter that stands out in everybody's fucking head who's played this game. There is a chapter that is a parody of Toy Story. And if you ever played Illbleed, this is a big spoiler, but it's worth hearing about. Let me tell you that much. It is quite a chapter. To explain this scenario, and if you know what Toy Story is, just throw what you think you know of Toy Story out the fucking window, because this chapter is a fucking ride. So, in this chapter of Illbleed, there is, you turn into playing as a costumed hero. There's this weird parasite creature who puts this costume on you. So you look like this knockoff of Woody from Toy Story, and his name is Toy Hunter. And Toy Hunter apparently went on this long journey. There was some movie, and he has sort of a cowboy theme, so it's like a western setup. But he finally returns home to his master, and his master has various toys. There are 3 that are featured in this. Our main character, Toy Hunter. There is this Buzz Lightyear ripoff, which is just this rocket ship. It's like a toy rocket ship that can fly but has limited fuel. It's not like a space hero, it's just literally a rocket ship. And then Woody ripoffs, Toy Hunter's love interest, who is a thing called Sexy Doll. And Sexy Doll is literally just some sort of weird undressed anime figurine who has this giant ass, and the ass is always pointed towards the camera in every scene that she appears in. So you just have these three characters that's like this Woody ripoff, and then a rocket, and then this anime figurine that has this giant bare ass that's just always pointing towards the camera for some weird reason. Anyways, what happens is that through an accident, our main character, Toy Hunter, accidentally kills his child, who's like supposed to be Andy. He looks terrifying though, so I know it's like this fucking monster, and it's terrifying when he dies because it's got these low-res graphics, and there's this scene where it's like eyeballs pluck out. And anyways, so he accidentally kills his hunter, and then his mom and parents are like, well, I guess our son just died. We better bury him with his favorite toy, which I guess his favorite toy happened to be the bare-assed anime figurine. So Sexy Doll, our Toy Hunter's love interest, gets buried with his kid he just accidentally killed. And our Toy Hunter character doesn't even give two fucks the fact they just killed a child. Instead, he wants to save his Sexy Doll! And he talks like that, by the way, and says it like that a lot, exaggeratedly. So he goes to the graveyard to dig up the body of the kid he just killed, his, kid that bought him, and he's been the toy of for ages. But when he digs up the grave to try and get Sexy Doll back, Sonic the Hedgehog shows up, except it's not really Sonic the Hedgehog. It looks a lot like him. It's Zodic the Hellhog that looks like a demonic Sonic the Hedgehog. And it turns out that Zodic the Hellhog is the devil and knows what Toy Hunter is trying to commit, and so he drags the kid and Sexy Doll down into hell. And now our toy can't die, so he needs to find a way to get to hell to save Sexy Doll from hell from Zodic the Hellhog. So he forms this plan where he decides he needs to kill another child. Well, actually what he needs to do is that he needs to become the favorite toy of a child and then kill the child so that he can be buried with the child so he can go to hell. And so our Woody from Toy Story ripoff goes to try and find a child, and he goes through this urban area, and there's some weird stripper enemies and some other things that you fight, and ultimately you get to this scenario where you do manage to kill the kid. You get this sort of scheme where you try to poison his food, and you have to make sure he doesn't notice, and then kill the child, and it turns out that he doesn't actually die. But they think he's dead from the poison, so he gets buried alive with you, and so that's fun. And so anyways, you and him get dragged off to hell, but there is some severe crimes you did because you just you just killed two kids at this point, and one of them was definitely on purpose. And so you go into this hell trial that sort of commences, and you are to be executed to go into a deeper hell, I guess. Because I guess in hell, if you've done something particularly atrocious, you don't get to stay in regular hell. There's a deeper hell that you will then get put on trial for. And it gets worse because when you're trying to get on trial, there's like these egg things that are these people in hell, and they're like, you break them on accident, and then the hell police come for you. Yeah, you go to an advanced hell. Anyways, so you're about to be executed for your crimes, but then the Buzz Lightyear knockoff apparently killed a child too to come and rescue you. And so then you fly off on the rocket ship guy, and you have to then maneuver to get to the boss fight with Zodic the Hellhog, which to mention, Zodic the Hellhog, they're not hiding the Sonic influence at all. When you hurt the boss, rings come flying out of it, and the rings kind of explode and do damage, and the boss does like spin dashes and all sorts of other... He does the Sonic Winger Wave whenever he lands a hit on you. It's very off. They don't hide what they're fucking making jokes of at all with that sequence, but all the same, that whole scenario stood out in a lot of players' minds. Like, a lot of the scenarios in the game are very, very strange. But that one is by far the strangest, and that one is probably the section of Illbleed that stuck out with a lot of people was the Toy Hunter chapter. Just because that is, for starters, why did they do a fucking Toy Story parody in the horror game? And second of all, what the fuck is this Toy Story parody? It's very, very strange. Fun, though. It's very entertaining. It's just very, very strange. And that's... Illbleed in general is a very strange game. It doesn't really play like any other horror game. There's some different rules based on what chapter you're playing, but you don't... I don't want to explain the whole entire game's rules, but I think that Illbleed manages to succeed what it is just because it is a game. When you're playing it, you literally, unless of course you know what happens, like what I'm saying right here, you literally have no fucking idea what's going to happen next in this game because it's so off the walls insane. Like not even just the chapter I just mentioned, all the chapters are fucking insane. There's this chapter involving a superhero and this worm thing, and no, actually, I'm not going to spoil them. There's a murder mystery chapter involving a superhero that's obviously a parody off of Batman and Superman combined, except Batman and Superman murdered somebody, and by the way, the superhero's name is Killer Man, so... and you have to figure out who Killer Man murdered. I know it's stupid, but the game's kind of stupid, but it's funny and entertaining stupid. And so then there's all these characters, and you need to sort of find evidence and call who it is, who was the real secret identity of Killer Man, because superheroes have, like secret identities. They're not always the superhero all the time, so you need to figure out the superhero's secret identity to charge them for murder. And anyways, it's a very strange game. And also there's a lot of other weird things about it. Like there's this famous Easter egg where, here's another spoiler here. If you play the game the first time, as every character you unlock as you unlock them, because there's multiple characters you can play as you unlock as you save them. Correction, you actually let them die or you can save them, but if you save all the characters in your first playthrough and play as each of them at least once, and get like the best ending you can on your first playthrough, on the second playthrough you have to let everyone die. So after you've gotten the best possible ending in your first playthrough, play the game again, and play the worst you can, let everyone die, don't save anyone, everyone needs to perish. And as you do this, every single chapter you do this, your main character, Eriko, she loses more and more of her clothing for no good reason, until literally at the very end, she has only fucking dirt covering her. And I guess her being naked makes the man in charge, who needs to give you $1 million, come out to ogle you, only to realize that he's your father, and he's this weird Power Rangers parody alien thing. And then he transforms into a giant head bat thing, and there's a lot of ooze stuff, and it gets kind of gross, but it's kind of interesting. And I don't know, it's a really weird game, okay? Very interestingly weird game, though. And these games were so bizarre, but full of a lot of charm, honestly, if you kind of get through them. They're, like, really out there, but they're fascinating. And the developer of these games, who made Blue Steiner and Illbleed, died way, way, way too soon. Back in the era of the PS2, GameCube, and Xbox, he was working on an enhanced version of Blue Steiner and Illbleed. The enhanced version of Blue Steiner was going to feature a new potential ending you could get, as well as a new secret boss monster, while Illbleed was going to feature a whole new attraction. He was also working on a sequel to Illbleed. Morning for everyone, and night. Yeah, I should probably sleep soon, but I'm just working off exhausted energy. Anyways, the developer was working on a sequel to Illbleed, as well as an enhanced Xbox port for Blue Steiner and Illbleed, but he died of heart failure, unfortunately, at the age of 42, just like Kenji Eno. And both of these developers are very interesting people. They released a few games that are very interesting, and I very much wish that they were still alive and active in the industry. I think that both of them had very original voices. They made games literally like no one else. And even if both of the games that they made were very rough, I think they made up for the roughness in pure creative energy and their games being very entertaining. They might not have been very good games, talking purely from a certain perspective, but they were very entertaining all the same. And I'm a little bit sad that they died way too young and didn't really get a chance to let more of their creative visions out onto the world. Yeah. I got way off track. That's okay, and I even said this at the beginning. There wasn't any sort of thing that was going to let me talk about this. One day I'd like to make a game that's inspired by Illbleed, only because there is literally nothing else quite like Illbleed. But another time... Another time. Anyways... what was the next game on the PlayStation 1 list? I should probably sleep soon. I've been up now for like an hour, 40 minutes rambling. And pardon me, my voice is getting a little bit tired of talking when I'm sleepy, but there's so much I could talk about. So much I haven't talked about. Even about the games I've talked about, there's so much more I can talk about. The next game on the list which I played is Echo Knight. Now to clarify, I've played the first Echo Knight game all the way through, got all the endings. I've played Echo Knight Beyond, got all the endings. That was the third game. The second game I have not beaten, but I've played for like 5 hours. The second game I want to replay at some point, though I should finish the save file I've got going and just get the worst possible ending, because that's what I'm headed towards. There's a weird thing about Echo Knight 2, which is smart, but neither the first Echo Knight game or the third Echo Knight game follow this. So if you don't know what Echo Knight is, and I've just said it multiple times, you're like, what the fuck is Echo Knight? It was a horror game trilogy released from Software, the people who are more well-known these days for Dark Souls and Bloodborne and Sekiro and all that. They, back in the PS1 and onto the PS2 days, released 3 first-person horror games called Echo Knight. I forget the second game's subtitle, but it's Echo Knight, the second Echo Knight game, which the second Echo Knight game only released in Japan, but got a fan English translation. And then the third game, which is probably the most famous in the Echo Knight series, which is the PS2 game, which is Echo Knight Beyond, which is a horror game where you're an astronaut on the moon with Ghost. Okay. The first Echo Knight is kind of interesting. It is a horror game, and there's a few moments where it can actually be a little bit scary, actually. But a lot of it is kind of like some sort of fantasy adventure game. Echo Knight has sort of an interesting thing going for it. Essentially, the idea behind Echo Knight is that you need to sort of progress through the game, unlock the facilities, but instead of combat, you have this heartbeat system where the closer you are to ghosts or things that are threatening, the higher your heart rate goes. And if your heart rate gets too high and you don't let it calm down or ease out, you will die because your heart rate gets to dangerous levels and you die of a heart attack, which, now that I'm thinking about it, Echo Knight is maybe not the best game to talk about after I literally just talked about 2 game directors that die of heart failure, but we're going to progress anyways. However, that's not the main interesting thing about Echo Knight. The more interesting thing is that you have to put all the ghosts to rest, and that changes like things about which ending you're getting and stuff. There's some ghosts that you have to 100% put down, but there's various ghosts that are optional to put down or not. But to put down ghosts, there are several methods. Some of them, you need to do something to appease them in the current world to make them be happy enough to move on, like give them an item that reminds them of someone or something like that. But a lot of them, essentially, you have to do something to transition to their memories and then play as them and do something in the past to appease their spirits in the present. That sounds weird, but it's kind of one of the big hooks of the Echo Knight series. Your character can like find bodies or items involved around these characters' spiritual energy, and when touching them will go to the past to play as a sequence as them where they can get a different fate or solve something for them that'll make their spirits move on. And it's kind of fascinating, but leads to a lot of very strange scenarios. Some of them are very creative and interesting. The first Echo Knight is set on a ship where everyone on the ship just died. I forget why they all just died, but they all did just die. Okay. And also to mention, there's some reoccurring motifs in the Echo Knight games. The third game takes place on the moon, and it makes sense if you played the first game and the second game, because there's kind of like a moon thematic through the game. So it's like these crystals that you get, which from making the spirits move on, and the crystals are from the moon, is what even the first game tells you. And there's also like this evil priest character who's reoccurring in all three games, and he tries to act like your friend and he helps you, but he's really like the fucking devil or something is trying to lead you astray. In the first Echo Knight, it's not too bad, but in the second Echo Knight, there's this thing that you can do where you can completely screw yourself over. Essentially, there's in the first and third Echo Knight games, which I played before I played the second game. Sorry, I've got like kind of a stuffy nose right now, I've noticed. But in between the first and third game, there is only one solution how to help the ghost pass on. There is one course of action for you to make them pass on. In the second game, they decided to get a little more creative with it, so that there is actually more than one solution to help almost every ghost in the game. But there is a best solution. If you help them through an easier or other method, you will make it so that the ghosts don't move on, but you solve their problem, but they get stuck permanently in this world. And I was kind of confused for a while. I thought that maybe I'd have to eventually go back and help these ghosts that didn't move on, until I found out later, it's like, oh no, it's not that I couldn't help them. I did the solution that completely boned them from moving on. So now it become impossible for me to get the best ending, because you need to make all the spirits move on to get the best ending. And it's the only game that sort of makes some tricky stuff, and it doesn't tell you that you can screw Ghost over, by the way. It's just something that you have to find out by yourself. And keep in mind, the other two games don't do this. It's only the second game that does this. So, not that I think it's a bad design decision. In fact, I think it's interesting. It's just different. And I wasn't really expecting it. And I got to a position where I was like 5 or 6 hours into the game, I realized, oh no, those ghosts I didn't help earlier. There's only like two ghosts I didn't help earlier, but because I didn't help those two ghosts, I was screwed from getting a good ending unless I replayed the game. And the two ghosts I didn't help in the right method were like towards the beginning of the game because I didn't understand the system or anything. So, yeah. It is what it is. Echo Knight Beyond, though, is fascinating. I think how good the story it is a little bit overblown. Before I'd played Echo Knight Beyond, I heard people say the game is a good story. It's not a bad story, but I wouldn't say it's a story to really write home about. It does have some interesting visual thematics, and some other things that does which are fascinating. But now and there is a sense, why can you make it more move and fulfill their deeds? 1 second, I'm going to blow my nose because I have a stuffed nose for a second. My nose, only the partial avail. Okay, so, but how, in a narrative sense, why you can't move him on? Well, let me kind of explain why. Like, so in retrospective, some of this stuff makes sense. Here is a perfect example. It's one of the ghosts I accidentally screwed over. There is some items that you get to help some ghost, and you need to do something to make one of the ghosts cheer up to help this other ghost move on, because there's this other ghost that's depressed that he can't see his girlfriend, and his girlfriend and the boyfriend are both there. The girlfriend is staying behind for a different reason. She doesn't want to see her boyfriend, but she's got some unfinished business that she needs to finish, which is why she's lingering here. So you need to do something at a certain point in the game to make it so that the girlfriend picks herself up and knows that there's hope, but not help her immediately. In other words, you need to make it so that she will go talk to the boyfriend ghost, but not pass on. What I accidentally did is I helped the girlfriend ghost pass on. And I thought I had something for the boyfriend ghost. What you're supposed to do is that you're supposed to make the girlfriend ghost get happy enough so that she'll talk to the boyfriend ghost, and then make the boyfriend ghost happy enough so he'll talk to the girlfriend ghost. I thought I was supposed to help them both move on individually. I didn't piece together yet that there was even more than one solution to do this. I thought that there was like some multiple steps to this, because I didn't realize there was, unlike the other two games, more than one way to help people. So what I did is I made the girlfriend ghost passed on, and then I tried giving the guy the thing to make him happy, but he couldn't get happy from it because his girlfriend had already passed on. So he was now permanently stuck to this world because I made the girlfriend ghost pass on before I helped the boyfriend ghost who needed to talk to the girlfriend ghost about something. And thus he was just kind of permanently screwed, stuck to this world because he could never find his peace to move on. Yep. But yeah, it's like that sort of stuff. That example was actually from the game. It was one of the two ghosts I accidentally screwed over from helping, but I didn't. It was like towards the beginning of the game. I didn't realize there was even this sort of system in the game. I thought I was going to have to help him later. What I thought in my head when I couldn't help him is that in the other Echo Knight games, there were some ghosts that you have to do multiple steps to make them pass on, and some of the ghosts, like there were some ghosts towards the beginning that you could only help towards the end. After you got certain key items and did other things. So I thought it was going to be like that, and I thought maybe the moral was that he had some other of his own personal business to move on. But no, it's just he was boned. So yeah. It is what it is. And I found that out quite a bit later when I did a little bit of an experiment when there was, because I was wondering why there was a couple ghosts I just couldn't seem to help. And there was a situation where I realized that there was a key item I could use to help this ghost, to help this other ghost, but if I did it, it'd screw over another ghost. And then I found this. I saved my game. I experimented, and after experimenting is when I found out that you could help one ghost, or not one ghost. You could end up in scenarios where you can make it so that ghosts could pass on, or just leave a ghost to suffer. And after I realized, I was like, oh no. The ghost didn't help earlier, and then I confirmed it with myself and looked it up, like, yeah, I'm not going to be able to get the best ending unless because I replay the whole entire game, because the ghost I didn't help were towards the very beginning of the game, and, yeah. In a design sense, it's, like, kind of confusing. You don't know for sure if you'll fuck your save for helping someone too soon. It's just part of the process. You're supposed to be paying attention to the story and pick up on some cues, and it makes sense in retrospective. I just wish when I had gone in I had known about this. At some point I need to upload the footage for that though, and I guess at some point I'll just do a whole new playthrough, and yeah. Part of the fun. 1 second, I'm gonna attempt 2 at blowing my nose here. A little bit of success, but it's a temporary success. Hopefully it'll play out okay still the same. Okay. There's a lot of things I can talk about. I think I'm getting a little more sleepy finally after it did take 2 hours like I thought it would. I did not cover as much ground as I thought I was going to. I really do go on rants, especially when I'm tired, don't I? Well, I have to go and have a dentist. I hope you have a good time at the dentist, Fabio. It's okay, I'm starting to realize that my sleepiness is finally starting to catch up with me after 2 hours. At some point, I would like to talk a lot more about horror games in general and horror game design, and probably do it when I'm not tired and I've refreshed myself more and I'm more prepared for this. It's a topic I have a lot of interest in. I talked less about game design, more about specific horror games towards the end there, but I do have a passion for them, so I guess that makes sense. Hopefully, this was interesting enough. If you thought this was interesting enough, then maybe I could do a fancier version of something like this, but which wasn't like thrown together in 5 minutes because I was tired and couldn't sleep. And I'll be talking when I'm not exhausted and with like partially sick. All the same though, hope it was interesting enough. Until next time, I shall bid adieu to all of you. Good night, everybody.